Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in history when silence is no longer an option. It is the moment when a continent scarred by wars, divisions, and foreign domination finally begins to ask itself, who is writing our future, and by what values? Over the past 2 decades, Africa has endured countless trials, from unfulfilled promises of democracy to economies suffocated by dependence. Yet, among those fractured pieces, a new generation is rising young leaders, many of them from military backgrounds, who understand that real power does not lie in weapons, but in faith in integrity and the dignity of human life. Names like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta of Mali, and Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger, they do not merely represent new governments, they embody a new spirit, an Africa that does not bow its head, does not copy imported models, and does not accept falsehood disguised as democracy. Amid that wave of transformation, Tanzania, once praised as a symbol of stability, suddenly became the epicenter of the greatest political crisis since the end of the Cold War. On the 29th of October, 2025, President Samia Suluhu Hassan declared victory with 97.6% of the vote, a number later adjusted to an even 98%. In that instant, the entire continent fell silent, not out of admiration, but out of disbelief. For somewhere deep in their memory, Africans had seen such numbers before numbers that did not reflect the voice of the people, but the silence of power. International organizations called it a historic victory, but across the cafes of Nairobi, the classrooms of Bamako, and the trading markets of Ouagadougou, people whispered a simple truth. No one can demand the trust of a nation with numbers already written in advance. And it was in that moment that Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, stepped forward and spoke aloud what so many had only dared to think. He was not merely responding to an election, he was confronting a decaying order, one in which democracy had become a tool, no longer a promise. For when truth is distorted, silence becomes complicity. And that is the moment when Africa begins to awaken. When the results of the Tanzanian election were announced, the world reacted with the same weary vocabulary of diplomacy. Deep concern, a call for transparency, hope for a process of reconciliation. But in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré did not choose the language of evasion. Standing before Parliament, his speech broadcast live across the nation, he spoke slowly, deliberately, every word cutting through the silence like a blade. A democracy cannot exist with 98% of the votes, where only one voice is allowed to be heard. That is no longer democracy, it is the monopoly of power. Those words resonated not as a political statement, but as a moral reminder. Traoré was not attacking a single individual. He was confronting an entire system that had lost its soul. He went on to say, when an election becomes a performance, when the people are no longer allowed to choose, then the ballots become symbols of fear, not of hope. From that platform, he called upon the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, and the African Union, AU, to temporarily suspend Tanzania's membership until a new election could be held under the supervision of independent international observers. It was more than a diplomatic move, it was a warning, a moral alarm. For he understood one truth that many have forgotten. Falsehood, if left unchallenged, will slowly be accepted as truth. And Africa, if it does not dare to correct itself, will forever be defined by others. Traoré continued, we cannot build a new Africa on fake democracies. We cannot preach freedom while our own hands still cover the mouths of our people. In the eyes of the Burkinabe people, he was more than a leader. He was the first man to name the truth that millions had felt, but never dared to say. The thunderous applause that erupted in the Ouagadougou chamber that day was not for a brilliant speech, but for courage, that rarest currency in modern politics. And from that moment on, the name Ibrahim Traoré was no longer tied only to Burkina Faso, but to something larger. A movement against the legitimization of autocracy. A moral uprising where ethical leadership was placed above the empty rituals of power. When the voice of Ibrahim Traoré rose from Ouagadougou, it did not stop at the borders of Burkina Faso. Like a bell struck in the middle of the desert, its echo traveled across the entire continent from the Horn of Africa to the shores of the Atlantic. In Nairobi, Kenya's President William Ruto, a man known for his measured tone and cautious diplomacy, broke the long-standing silence of East African leaders. In an interview with Al Jazeera, he smiled faintly and said a single sentence that shook the region. In a true democracy, 97% does not exist. That number belongs only to dictatorships. No condemnation. No rallying cry. Yet that simple statement alone was enough to crack the wall of silence many believed would never fall. Within less than 24 hours, the phrase African Truth Bloc began to spread across social media, a new moral pact of Africa's younger generation of leaders. Never to remain silent in the face of deception, and never to bow to power. Kenya, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, four nations differing in language, culture, and faith, suddenly found common ground in one unshakable value: truth. The speeches of Ruto and Traoré were swiftly censored in Tanzania. The government ordered media outlets to delete the clips, block keywords, and suppress all related imagery. Yet in an age when the internet has become the people's voice, every act of censorship only amplified the message. From the universities of Kigali to the tea houses of Dakar, from the crowded slums of Lagos to the online forums of Johannesburg, young Africans began reposting the fragments of their words, adding a single caption: the Second African Awakening. Eswin, it was not just a political movement. It was the expression of a generation born into poverty and broken promises, now united by a single hunger, honesty, and leadership. Because they understood this simple truth: when the words of those in power no longer reflect reality, democracy becomes nothing more than a mask. Within weeks, the movement spread like fire in dry grass, without parties, without banners, without funding, carried only by conviction. Its core message was as clear as it was revolutionary. Democracy cannot be measured by vote percentages, but by the level of trust between the people and their leaders. And from the dusty cafes of Ouagadougou to the formal chambers of international institutions, one name began to resonate: Ibrahim Traoré, no longer seen merely as a young officer, but as the herald of a new age of honesty for Africa. Not long after the wave of the African Truth Bloc began to spread, voices from the southern part of the continent started to rise. One of the first to break the silence was former president of Botswana, Ian Khama, once regarded as a symbol of integrity during his years in power. At a lecture at Lukenya University, before thousands of students, Khama spoke without hesitation. When a leader convinces themselves that only they can rule, that is not a sign of strength, it is a sign of fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of truth. Fear of their own people. He did not shy away from naming Samia Suluhu Hassan directly, calling her an illegitimate president, and he publicly listed what he described as undeniable evidence, from the assassination of opposition aide Tundisu, to the arrest of more than 1,200 members of the opposition party Chadma, to the disqualification of 14 out of 15 opposition candidates from the election. Khama called upon the Southern African Development Community, SADC, the African Union, AU, and even the United Nations to impose symbolic sanctions, forcing the Tanzanian government to respect the region's charter on democracy. His powerful words did not stand alone. Mokgweetsi Masisi Khama's successor, and the current head of the African Union's election observation mission, delivered a statement that left the whole in Addis Ababa utterly silent. Tanzania has committed a grave violation of the African Union Charter on democracy, human rights, and governance. An election without free choice, without opposition, without independent oversight cannot be considered an expression of the people's will. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the African Union released an official report rejecting the legitimacy of an election in one of its member states. It was not merely a political act. It was a moral turning point, a signal that a forgotten ethical standard was being restored. At a press conference, a journalist asked Masisi, "Are you not afraid that this decision will fracture the unity of the AU?" He paused, then replied simply, "Unity built on silence is not unity. It is complicity." That sentence became a quote that swept across the continent. People called it the Addis moment, the moment when the African Union, for the first time, chose what was right over what was convenient. From that point onward, the story was no longer about Tanzania alone. It had become a moral test for an entire continent. Would Africa have the courage to cleanse its own wounds, or continue to hide them beneath the paint of political stability? When the African Union officially refused to recognize the election results in Tanzania, the ripple effect was immediate. Emergency meetings were convened in Gaborone, Niamey, and Abuja. Africa, long accustomed to the comfort of old order and quiet diplomacy, suddenly found itself entering one of the deepest divides since the dawn of independence. The Southern African Development Community, SAD, known for its typically cautious and conciliatory stance, issued an unusually strong statement. It described Tanzania's electoral process as lacking transparency, lacking freedom, and lacking inclusivity. The communiqué called for the establishment of a special delegation to re-examine the entire election procedure and to consider temporarily suspending Tanzania's membership from regional cooperation mechanisms. Such a statement, coming from SADC, an organization that had remained silent through many past crises, carried significance far beyond politics. It was a declaration that power, no matter how ceremonially wrapped or statistically embellished, could never conceal the truth. At the same time, the newly formed Alliance of Sahel States, AES, led by figures such as Traoré, Goita, and Chiani, released an even more uncompromising declaration. We cannot remain silent when a brother nation tramples on the will of its people. We are not intervening in internal affairs, but we have a moral duty to defend the dignity of Africa. If this statement was more than symbolic, it marked the emergence of two opposing philosophies on the continent, one believing that stability is more important than freedom, and the other insisting that freedom is the only foundation upon which real stability can stand. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, though lacking direct jurisdiction in East Africa, also issued a formal expression of deep concern over the growing loss of trust between the Tanzanian government and its people. Those words may have sounded mild, but in the language of diplomacy, deep concern is the final phrase spoken before isolation begins. In internal discussions, analysts began to call the unfolding crisis the Dar es Salaam fault line, a new dividing line splitting Africa in two halves, one that still believes in numbers, and another that believes in truth. This divide was not merely political, it was moral. Behind every ballot, behind every communiqué, lay a larger question. Would Africa define itself by truth or by fear? And amid all those voices, Ibrahim Traoré remained silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood something profound, that sometimes the silence of an honest man can echo louder than all the noise in the world. In Dar es Salaam, the first reactions from the Tanzanian government came swiftly and sharply. The office of President Samia Suluhu Hassan issued a statement nearly 2,000 words long, accusing a coordinated smear campaign led by military leaders in the Sahel region. The declaration asserted that the October election had been entirely legitimate, supported by the people, and conducted peacefully, while condemning neighboring nations for interfering in the internal affairs of Tanzania. Yet beneath those firm proclamations, the world saw something else. Isolation, quiet, cold, and tightening around Samia like an invisible grip. Those who had once been her allies now turned away in silence. Rwanda, Tanzania's closest neighbor and former partner, sent only its vice president to the inauguration. President Paul Kagame cited a scheduling conflict with the Kigali summit, but everyone understood the real message. Kigali wanted no photograph of its leadership standing beside a government now under suspicion. Uganda, under Yoweri Museveni, sent a message of congratulations but no delegation, and no words of support. South Africa and Zimbabwe, countries that traditionally championed stability above all else, attended the ceremony but delivered speeches so muted they bordered on absence. There were no congratulations, no familiar phrase, "We respect the will of the Tanzanian people," only formal presence, cold and distant, like shadows fulfilling obligation. In diplomacy, what is left unsaid often carries more weight than any accusation. And that silence deliberate. Heavy began to close around Tanzania like walls of stone. The international press soon coined a phrase for it, the empty circle, a haunting image of a government that still occupied its seat, yet had lost its audience. When Samia's inauguration was broadcast live, viewers noticed rows of vacant chairs where delegations should have been. No applause, no waving flags, only the sterile glare of television lenses capturing the solemn face of a president forcing a smile. From Addis Ababa, African Union observers quietly remarked, Tanzania is now facing a moral referendum, not a political one. Because in today's world, no government can truly call itself legitimate when it stands isolated from its own brothers and sisters. Samia, once praised as one of Africa's few female heads of state, a symbol of progress, had become an emblem of dissonance between two eras, one fading, where power was guarded by silence, and one rising, where trust is built upon truth. Tanzania, once hailed as the beacon of stability in East Africa, had turned into a test for the entire continent, a test of courage, of conscience, Would Africa dare to ask itself the most fundamental question: what does democracy mean when it no longer reflects the voice of the people? And while accusations continued to flow from Dar es Salaam, in Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako, there were no angry retorts, only a simple reply, calm, unshaken, and clear. Truth needs no defense. Amid Tanzania's deepening political and diplomatic crisis, Ibrahim Traoré emerged as a rare symbol of self-determination and political integrity. While other leaders chose silence or hid behind vague, cautious communiques, he stood at the very center of the storm, not to seek the spotlight, but to affirm a principle: Africa cannot be defined by pretension. At the Forum of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, in Ouagadougou, attended by the leaders of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, Traoré spoke into a hall so still that one could hear the soft hum of the cameras. He had no prepared notes, no slogans. His voice was low, deliberate, and calm. We do not need the recognition of the West, but we must recognize one another through truth, not through 98%. F-7. Those words were quoted across the continent as a declaration, not of defiance, but of awakening. For decades, many African nations had been trapped between two poisons: external control and internal deception. Now, a new generation sought to reject both. Regional media began to call Traoré the African Che, not because he preached violent revolution, but because he reignited the flame of truth in a political world numbed by half-truths. On social media, millions of young Africans shared his image in his sand-colored uniform, eyes steady on the camera with the caption, "Integrity is our weapon, dignity is our armor." To them, Traoré was not merely a military leader. He was the first of their time to speak the words their fathers had feared to say. In his presence, they saw proof that an independent Africa was not a dream, it was a decision. From Niamey to Bamako, local newspapers began calling him the banner of the new generation of resistance, a generation that did not rise against people, but against deceit. They sought not power, but truth. In Burkina Faso, enormous murals appeared in crowded markets, depicting Traoré standing between historical figures like Thomas Sankara and Kwame Nkrumah. Beneath the images, a line was painted in bold letters: "Africa does not need heroes, we need real human beings." Yes, and perhaps that is what sets him apart. He never tried to become a symbol. It was his honesty, his humility, that made others make him one. In an age where every political word is weighed, rehearsed, and filtered, Ibrahim Traoré chose the hardest path of all, to speak the truth and accept its price. But in that price, Africa rediscovered something far more precious than power: its self-respect. The electoral crisis in Tanzania in the year 2025, at first glance, appeared to be nothing more than a domestic political dispute. Yet for Africa, it struck like lightning across a land, long parched a moral thunderclap, awakening an entire continent from the slumber of silence. It was not merely a story about ballots. It was a reckoning with the soul of African democracy. Do we still believe in the true will of our people? For in every manipulated election, there lies not only fraud but betrayal. A betrayal of the faith ordinary citizens, from farmers in Mwanza to teachers in Arusha, placed in the promise of honest governance. And once that trust is broken, it is not just politics that collapses, but the very idea of human dignity itself begins to fracture. Yet, strangely, it was within that darkness that light emerged. For the first time in decades, Africa witnessed a leadership movement not built on economic gain or the patronage of global powers, but on something deeper: moral conviction. Under the guiding spirit of Ibrahim Traoré, a new generation of leaders began to redefine the meaning of power. No longer a means to rule, but a duty to preserve the truth. They dared to do what previous generations hesitated to declare that not every elected government is legitimate, and not every counted vote reflects the voice of the people. They forced regional institutions, from the African Union, AU, to the Southern African Development Community, SADC, to stand before their own moral mirrors. Would they choose silence or righteousness? And when institutions once dismissed as ceremonial began to speak out, Africans understood that an era had ended, the era of overwhelming numbers, concealing deception, the era when people were told, accept this for the sake of stability. But what stability can stand upon fear? What peace can be born from the silence of conscience? In the long history of global politics, change seldom begins with the small or the weak. But Africa has often rewritten that rule. From Nkrumah's Ghana to Sankara's Burkina Faso, from Mandela's South Africa to the valleys of Mali, the boldest steps have always come from places dismissed as fragile. Dignity, after all, has never been measured by geography but by courage. And now once again, Burkina Faso, a modest nation in the dry heart of the Sahel, had become a bell tolling for nearly 2 billion souls. Its echo carried a message. A continent is only strong when it is honest with itself. From Niamey to Nairobi, from Bamako to Gaborone, a new phrase began to ripple through conversations. The new African era, an era where leaders would no longer be honored for the offices they hold, but for the integrity they embody. An era where success would no longer be measured by the length of a term, but by the depth of trust a people return to their government. Traoré, Goita, Ruto, Masisi, 5 men of different origins, faiths, and histories shared one unshakable truth. Democracy is not a gift wrapped in Western aid, nor a shield to guard personal power. Democracy is a living covenant, a vow between leader and citizen, upheld not by rhetoric, but by courage and respect. That spirit now bears a name, the African Truth Bloc. No treaties, no crests, no bureaucracy, only one shared creed. If truth no longer has a place in politics, then politics no longer has meaning to the people. It is a simple message yet profound. For in a world where images and propaganda can bury reality, the act of speaking truth has become an act of revolution. And Africa, after centuries of being silenced, is learning once again how to speak in its own voice and with its own conscience. Today, Africa is transforming not only through skyscrapers or 5G towers, but through a deeper evolution of political awareness. People no longer wish merely to survive. They wish to live with dignity. They no longer demand only the right to vote. They demand that their votes matter. They no longer ask only for jobs. They ask for honesty in the promises made to them. The Tanzanian crisis, like others before it, will eventually fade, but its legacy will endure, etched in the memory of a generation that watched truth distorted and vowed never to remain silent again. From that realization, a new class of citizens is being born, citizens who no longer fear power, but demand that power fear them. Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as a reckless young general, is now remembered as a mirror of integrity. He has not sought titles nor built monuments to himself. He has simply done one radical thing: spoken the truth and preserved his dignity. In a world built on illusion, that simplicity has become an act of greatness, not through anger, but through self-respect, not through violence, but through honesty. Traoré has rekindled a forgotten principle, that the power of righteousness does not lie in shouting, but in steadfastness. And perhaps the greatest message he offers not only to Tanzania, but to the world is the closing line that once held the hall of Ouagadougou in breathless silence. We do not fight to be praised. We fight so that our children will never have to bow their heads. Democracy is not a gift from anyone. It is a mirror reflecting our own dignity. In that moment, many wept not out of sorrow, but from the awakening realization that after so many years, Africa was speaking of itself not through pain, but through pride. As dawn spreads across the red clay rooftops of the Sahel, through the golden dust and the swaying palms, one feels that something irreversible has changed. Africa is no longer the continent of forgotten promises. It is entering a new age, an age of courage, of truth, of faith in the idea that no matter how deeply buried, truth will always find its voice. And as the drums of celebration echo through the streets of Ouagadougou, as children sing new songs of freedom, the world can sense that African history has turned a page toward a generation of people who no longer bow their heads, but lift them high, looking straight into the future, believing that an honest Africa will be an unbreakable Africa.